Okay, so the session is now sorry. The session is now recorded. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome once again to Soksai 100 Week 4. So we're now on to the fourth week. Um, Now, as I've mentioned earlier, I want to deliver two topics today. But before I do that, I wanted to make some announcements first. The first one isn't really an announcement, but this is more of a question. Um, do you get notified whenever I update or edit or post something in Google Classroom?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Okay. Because I don't have the option to see the platform from a student's perspective. So I just want to make sure that you get notified. For example, because what I do is that, for example, for week 3, after we're done with the session, I will edit that folder. I edit that folder, or I edit that particular section in Google Classroom, and I upload there the link to the recording in the Zoom cloud, tsaka sa yung naka-archive sa Google Drive. Okay. Again, there are two ways to access the recordings because by default Zoom limits the storage of the recording to 15 days. So pagka hindi nyo ma-access doon, you can access it alternatively sa Google Drive, which you have access to until the remainder or until the end of the semester. So good. So you get notification. So hindi lang sa post, hindi lang sa update sa stream, but even if I edit something, you get notified, right? So when I edited the week 3 folder, you get notified as well. You got notified. Okay. So that's good to know. So if for those of you who are having problems accessing or navigating the Google Classroom platform, please feel free to let me know, and I'll schedule maybe a virtual meeting so I could guide you through it. Now the second announcement is this one. So I've got the chance to see. I've had the chance to see the updated calendar, and I'm still making some inquiries with the higher ups, because the one thing I found is that there was an announcement that said that the 16 weeks will be kept, but I don't know if part of that 16 weeks would be the reading break or the reading slash wellness break, or would it not be counted at all? Because if it would not be counted, then week 9 officially would fall on the 14th and 15th of April, and both of those days are holidays, which means again, by following the memo of the college, we would have to schedule a makeup class. But again, that's something that I don't know yet, how we can arrange, because we've also um or we will be encountering that holiday for that particular week. But in any case, I will keep you posted. I will be uploading an updated version of the course plan over the weekend. No, so I'm arranging the things. I'm arranging the sequence of the topics, but I guess the major thing that would change would be, instead of having the research seminar and workshop after the reading break, we will be having it on week 8. Kasi ang mangyayari, 7 April to 13 April would be the reading and wellness break. So before that is week 8, and then after that, of course, week 9. Okay? So we will do the research seminar and workshop before. Okay? But again, that's something that is open to changes. No, maybe we can talk about that next meeting. Uh, because I want to know whether it would be beneficial for you to have it before your writing or after. Okay. Um. All right. So now that is out of the way. I do want to begin by, if you remember last meeting, um, we ended with the question of science, right? And if you remember the pattern that we're taking over the previous 2 weeks, no, when we're trying to define, not over the previous 2 weeks, but basically over the previous week, we're trying to dig deeper into the questions that are otherwise overlooked. No, so we want to define social sciences, and we noted that it would be difficult to define it just by enumerating, a set of disciplines. And so, if we are to properly define the social sciences, if we are properly to understand the nature of the social sciences, then we would have to understand first and foremost what science is. And uh, based on what I provided you on the dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary entry, science has a lot of usage. No, the term science has a lot or basically is used in a lot of ways that some of which are already archaic, meaning they're no longer in use. No? But we managed to pick up, I hope you read the entries as well. We managed to pick up some important definitions, right? Some important, and one of those things would be that science is a body of knowledge. And I was trying to hint at this last time because normally, especially in our context, no, in the Philippine context, when we speak of science, we automatically think of the natural sciences. We think of we think of physics, chemistry, biology, etc. We think of computations, you know. Uh, but in the French and the German context, okay, and I invoke the French because the word science has its etymology in French, right? Yung science na tinatawag nila. Um, I they have a very broad and general definition of science, no? And what does that where does that lead us? They think of science basically as just a body of knowledge, and it could be, we could trace it all the way back to its Latin origins of sire, meaning to know. And so the French had their science, the German had their Wissenschaft, no, and the sciences in German are very broad, right? It's not restricted to a particular, general field or discipline. So when you speak of sciences in Germany, you always speak of a body of knowledge, right? You always speak of a body of knowledge. So when you speak of sciences in Germany, in the German language, you have two major categories. Have I mentioned this last time? Not yet. Hindi pa? Not yet. Okay. So hold on. Let's pull up a virtual whiteboard here. Yeah. Oh, so I was able to mention it. Um, yes, that's, yeah, Wissenschaft. That's correct, Leo. So in German, you have the term Wissenschaft, right? Uh, so again, I'm enabling chat to everyone. Please send your messages to everyone. So in German, you have the term Wissenschaft, and you have two major classifications of sciences. right? Science. Wissenschaften is plural, sciences. So you have two major classifications. You have Naturwissenschaften, which is natural sciences, and Geisteswissenschaften. Okay. Now the word Geist is a bit complex because in the German language, Geist means spirit. Okay, but of course, it's not spirit as in ghost or something hovering. Hindi kaluluwa, hindi espiritu sa konteksto natin, but spirit as in mind or psyche, which brings us to the human. So Geisteswissenschaften is human sciences. And of course, in other contexts, human sciences is called what? You have the humanities. So in the German context, humanities is part of the sciences, whereas more often than not, in the context we're mostly familiar with, humanities is opposed to the social sciences, right? So okay, I hope this is clear. Now, now that we have an understanding of science in very broad terms, no, this doesn't mean that uh the science that we're familiar with is not really science, but that is simply to say that it simply prepares the ground for us, to understand why inquiries, social inquiries of sort, can become scientific, or how is it possible to categorize social inquiries from a scientific or under a scientific umbrella. Okay, so one of the main ideas that I would like you to understand is that the social sciences is by and large a creation in modernity. Much of the disciplines that we know, again, we try to avoid being very specific here, but there are at least five first disciplines, as they call it, that emerged in modernity, that was institutionalized in modernity. Okay, but again, we have to be careful here. It's not to say that they didn't exist before. History was definitely, an ancient, a very ancient discipline. So is economics, so is anthropology. But what I mean by institutionalization is that it became part of the academic life, right? It became part of the academic culture. And later on, when we, because I've now chosen the topic for the medieval part of this module, what I wanted to do there is to talk to you about the rise of the universities, because the first universities were founded in the medieval ages, in the Middle Ages. And one very important thing that we have to note there is that there are commentators, there are historians that would say that the medieval university set set the conditions for the scientific revolution. And I find it that is quite a stretch, because the medieval university was conducting inquiry in the name of God. But then again, sorry, commentators like Edward Grant, or historians like Edward Grant, would tell us that without the university, the institutionalization of inquiry would not have been possible. So we could give him that, but we'll talk more about that later down the line. So the social sciences as you know it today, the disciplines that you know it today, were more or less a creation of modernity. Now, I don't want to be, or I don't want to focus too much on where to, pinpoint the start, the beginning of modernity. That would be an extremely um comprehensive task to undertake. There are lots of debates about that. But for the moment, we can suggest that modernity is a period that covers, 18th century, beginning 18th century. And um, we situate the beginning of modern sciences the modern social sciences during this period. And it did manifest clearly during the foundation of the first modern universities in the 19th century, no? So the 1800s. So now, why did it emerge? Now, what is why did it emerge? Why did it become a big deal, so to speak? One of the another main thing that you have to understand is that the social sciences, by virtue of their being modern, does not suggest that they did not exist in the past. Social inquiries have always been there, right? You need to have an appreciation of philosophy in order to understand, how social inquiries, how inquiries about man and society have been there since the ancient times, right? But what makes it different in modernity is that these social inquiries adopted a different language, so to speak. No, they adopted a different language, which meant that they adopted the language of the natural sciences. Now, why is that the case? That's that's the sort of the historical trajectory that I want to cover. I want to try to cover today, right? So, I've gathered that, uh, based on no, sorry, I hope that you were able to read, number one, the reading on Copernicus, right? Which is slotted for last week. And secondly, the reading authored by Robert Redfield, which is The Art of Social Sciences. We'll deal with Redfield towards the second part because more or less that's a very soft introduction to the social sciences, following some basic or preliminary understandings that we already have. And what we'll do in the first part is talk about Copernicus, talk about the Copernican revolution, talk about the origins of modern science. Because if we say that the modern social sciences emerged out of the modern sciences, then we need to understand what made science modern, right? Because, of course, as we know, science has always already been there. So the question is, what made science modern, right? So I want us to talk about first the reading on Copernicus, right? And okay, have you read the text? Has anyone read the text?
Art of Social Sciences po ba, sir?
Sorry,
Art of Social Sciences po ba yung nire-refer ng text, sir?
ano yan?
Art of Social Sciences po ba yung text na nire-refer niyo, sir?
Sorry, that's a bit choppy. Copernicus, the text on Copernicus, the one I uploaded for week 3. Have you read it? Okay, that's good. So I hope the others have read it as well. All right, so we can talk about that now. Um, hold on for a while. I'm just so the text that you've read is not actually the main text. This is just the dedication, no, the dedication part. But I wanted you to read that because it sort of sets the tone as to what sort of context Copernicus did his scientific studies. So the text is originally titled, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, no, on the revolution of the heavenly spheres, or on the revolution of the celestial spheres. Um, and what this tells us is, again, the context, no, the historical context against which Copernicus was doing his scientific studies. Right? So how did you find the reading? What sort of ideas struck you in the reading? What parts, remained with you, or what sort of questions have you had while reading the text or after reading the text? Maybe we can begin with that. Yeah, Joshua.
Hindi naman po siya question, pero interesting lang po na observation na parang ang labas po ng text is parang humihingi po siya ng protection sa Santo Papa. So, kasi parang alam niya po na mariridicule po siya ng community. So parang humihingi po siya ng approval at protection ng Santo Papa bago niya po ilabas yung ideas niya, which I think in today's society po is laughable.
That's a very good point, Joshua. And again, for those of you who've read the text, I'm sure you're familiar with what Joshua is talking about here. For lack of a better term, Copernicus was trying to parang sumisip-sip siya. Diba? I think that's what Joshua is trying to say here. He's trying to appeal to the authority of the Pope. 'Di ba? Kaya nga tinatawag niya, sinasabi niya, you are the most eminent, you are the most learned scholar in this field. And well, that's arguable because of course, but on the other hand, we also don't know too much about, maybe we have to look into the biography of that particular Pope to know whether he is indeed a learned, a learned scholar in mathematics. But what is interesting there is what Joshua pointed out. The Copernicus seems to be appealing to the authority of the Pope. Now, why is that the case? Why do you think? And this is an open question, no, because I want you to understand where Copernicus is coming from. He isn't, simply. He isn't simply an ass kisser, no, for lack of a better term. But why do you think is he doing this? Why do you think is he being like this? Anyone? Leo says, okay. Big deal in what way, Leo? So Leo says in the chat, big deal ang heliocentric theory for Christians. All right, yeah. Nasisira yung thought na humans ang center ng universe. That is put well. No, that is kumbaga it captures the point, right? What Leo says here captures the point of what I want you guys to understand. The radical work of Copernicus was dedicated to the Pope, right? And for a brief period of time, a very, very brief period of time, it was entertained, it was accepted, it was thought of as plausible. But then there are certain dangers in accepting the argument. No, there are certain dangers in accepting the argument, such as when we think about it, no, the what do you call this? The human beings, which is again the creation of God, loses its place at the center of the universe. And that has profound significance for theologians, right? Now, the second thing is, on a more practical level, the reason why Copernicus is being like that is because we could speculate here that he is trying to avoid censorship. The biggest threat to a scholar is censorship, especially during these times, because the church has the authority, no, to excommunicate these scholars, right? And when you're excommunicated, no one will really care about your work anymore. So even the most radical philosophers, I forgot if anyone here in attendance is a philo minor, but even up until the time of Immanuel Kant, censorship was a very big, was a very huge thing. And so, for example, Copernicus appealed to the Pope in his dedication. Uh, Rene Descartes and David Hume, even if they wrote some very critical works, whenever they corresponded to authority, such as the king, they would always sign their letters with "your most humble servant." No, the same with Kant. Kant was doing the same, and of course Descartes wrote in Latin instead of French. But in any case, that's very important to understand, because Copernicus here is advancing a very radical idea, an idea that would not just cause some destabilizations insofar as church doctrine is concerned. It would also cause some disturbances in the authorities that the church accepted, which was the Aristotelian framework of physics, right? Um, who is Copernicus criticizing here in his work? What is the framework that Copernicus is trying? What is the framework that Copernicus was trying to overcome? Would anyone know? So we know that Copernicus was advancing a heliocentric model of the universe. And ano ba yung heliocentric? The heliocentric theory means that the sun is at the center. No, the sun is at the center, and it's not the case that the Earth is at the center, which is called what? What do we call that theory that suggests that the Earth was at the center of the universe? Geocentric. Okay, so geocentric, and geocentric theory was advanced by, was the famous advocate of geocentrism, Ptolemy. All right. So Ptolemy's geocentric model remained unquestioned for how many years? For a very very long time. No, and the church, because a part of the history of the church is Christianizing or baptizing pagan scholars, right? That's why in the Middle Ages there are very known parallelisms. No, Saint Augustine was the baptized Plato. Thomas Aquinas was the baptized Aristotle, because they appropriated many stuff from the ancient period, even cosmology, even physics. And one of those things was the geocentric model, which Aristotle was also an advocate of, even before Ptolemy. Ptolemy kasi systematized the geocentric theories that came before him. Oh. So, all right. What else did you find about the text? What else was of interest to you? What else was confusing, if any? How about the others? Anyone else? What did you find about the reading? Okay, so Irish says here in the chat, I think it's the way he sent this letter to relate his findings on astronomy in connection to the scripture or calendar of the said religion. What do you mean by this, Irish? Could you explain a bit more?
Like, sir, nung by the end of the letter, he mentioned here the relationship of the importance of finding out about the heliocentric in relation to the calendar. What's the ecclesiastical what's this ecclesiastical calendar? So I think it's vital to know the length of the years or the months, just like how he mentioned here. Yun po.
Okay, yeah, I get what you mean. So ecclesiastical calendar. Ecclesiastical means church, simply.
Yes.
Church calendar. Of course, the revision of the way we understand the movement, the positioning of the heavenly bodies would also affect the way we compute our time, 'di ba? Kaya nga yung calendar natin, the one that we use today, is not really something that has been with us for, for ages. I mean, it has been with us for long, but before that we had different, versions of calendars. No, we have the Gregorian, and we have other um types of calendars that corresponded with the findings of the church regarding the position of the heavenly body. So yeah, that is important as well. Thank you, Irish. How about the others? It doesn't necessarily have to be a thought, no, a critical reflection. It could be in a form of a question. Did you find something difficult? Did you find something confusing? Did you find something vague in the text that we can perhaps clarify here in the class?
Hello, sir. Yes po.
Who is that? Yes, Jubilee. Yeah.
Sir, yung in which metaphorical way did Copernicus refer po yung to drones among bees? Yun po, medyo ano po ako doon.
Sorry, what did you say?
In which metaphorical way did Copernicus refer to drones among bees?
The drones among bees. All right, let's take a look at that passage. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so I think this is the part that Jubilee was trying to tell us. All right, so let's read this here. They did this, it seems to me, not as some think, because of a certain selfish reluctance to give their views to the world, but in order that the noblest truths worked out by the careful study of great men should not be despised by those who are vexed at the idea of taking great pains with any forms of literature except such as would be profitable, or by those who, if they are driven to the study of philosophy for its own sake by the admonitions and example of others, nevertheless, on account of their stupidity, hold a place among philosophers similar to that of drones among bees. Right, this is particularly an interesting metaphor, but um, what do you think about it? Before I give my thoughts on this, the others are free to jump in as well. I really want this to be a sort of, an interactive discussion. So, how do you understand this sort of metaphor? Anyone? And when I looked it up, the metaphor seems unique to Copernicus. Right? I didn't see it as a very what do you call this? As a very common metaphor. No. So based on what he is saying there, but yeah, before I say my thing, maybe the others would like to share their thoughts. Yeah. So one could interpret it as if Copernicus was saying something about, something that doesn't fit in place, right? Something that doesn't fit in a certain categorization, something that is out of place. And I'm not really sure about uh the metaphor itself, because again, when I looked it up, it seems unique to Copernicus. It doesn't seem that there was another use of the metaphor apart from Copernicus usage of the metaphor. So it might well be that he's trying to simply point out how uh you know certain things are not in place or fit out of place, right? So there could be that, and there could be other ways of interpreting it, but my line of interpretation comes from um the argument that he's trying to share in that particular passage. Okay, but that is very interesting. That is an interesting way of putting it, Jubileen. Thank you for that. All right, how about the others? Any sort of difficulties you encountered in the text, any sort of passages that you found difficult to understand, or anything that you would like to share at all in relation to the reading? Questions, be it questions, concerns, clarifications. Okay. All right. So let me now go to the presentation. If you haven't had the chance to read the text, I urge you to read it. It's a very short text. I think it's 3 pages, only 3 pages. Um, and it sort of gives you this idea of how Copernicus presented his heliocentric theory, how he strategically, presented his radical theory. Because again, the word radical and the word, orthodoxy or church orthodoxy, more often than not in the history of thought, they don't go well together. What I'm trying to say is that the church has always been allergic to new stuff, new things. No? So let's talk about the origins of modern science. So if we are to understand the origins of modern social sciences, then we have to understand the origins of modern science. Now, okay, I think we're done with this. We'll talk about this later, no? What makes something a science. Okay. So for about 2.5 centuries, starting the 1500s, the world saw a rapid period of scientific development. A period of rapid scientific development known as the scientific revolution. Now, to be clear, for those of us, for those of you here rather who are history majors, again, a lot of periodizations in history are often debatable. These are disputed things. Kailan ba talaga nagsimula? Kailan magtatapos? So we more or less approach this in a very convenient manner and suggest that from 1500s to 1750s, nagkaroon ng tinatawag na scientific revolution. It was a period of rapid scientific development, right? It is characterized as a rapid scientific development, of course, in relation to or in reference to the growth of science prior to this period, which is because of the medieval period, because of the Middle Ages. The growth of science was to a large extent stunted. It doesn't mean that there were no discoveries during the medieval period, doesn't mean that there were no scientific advancements. It's just that at the rate at which science should have grown, it definitely slowed down during the medieval period. Because again, the church was very protective of its doctrines, of its orthodoxy. So it doesn't automatically welcome what is new. Okay. So of course, when we talk about modern science, it's important to note that the qualifier modern is something that serves as an important what do you call this? An important term, basically, well, to qualify what science is. Okay, what I mean here is that we do not wish to say that there were no scientific pursuits in the ancient and medieval world. No, we know for a fact that there are sciences in the ancient world as well as in the medieval period. Right? So the qualifier modern is important. What we are talking about here is modern science. Right? Now, a brief caveat is that I've hinted this earlier. We need not regard the medieval ages or the Middle Ages as it is typically regarded as the Dark Ages. No. Again, as I've mentioned, there are a lot of scientific advancements during that time. It's just that the authority of the church was so prevalent, it stunted the growth of science. No. Kumbaga merong pumipigil, merong blockage, merong obstacles sa growth ng science, which was very much abolished by the 1500s to the 1750s. Okay? So if you are interested in that, in that sort of thing, I would recommend, hindi pala siya bukas dito sa akin. In any case, I would recommend reading a book titled The Light of the Middle Ages, okay, by Seb Falk, because that sort of provides us an insight into the scientific adventures in modern science, in medieval science. Okay. So modern science in general was a reaction against the long-standing and prevailing scientific worldviews, which were advanced in Greek antiquity. No, Aristotelian physics, of course, as I've already mentioned earlier, this remained unchallenged. Well, not until modernity. I was probably overestimating it here. Not until modernity, but at least until the 1500s. right? At least until the 1500s, the Aristotelian physics was dominant. And it again, the reason why it became dominant, the reason why it was able to preserve its influence is because the church adapted it. Okay. So Aristotle, and we know Aristotle as a philosopher, right? Um, I'm sure you've encountered Aristotle in your senior high school philosophy classes, but if you're wondering why Aristotle was responsible, or why Aristotle, a philosopher, was responsible for a very influential scientific worldview, it is because that during his time there wasn't any disciplinary boundaries. But there wasn't anything that suggests that you could only do one aspect of science and not do the other, right? That's why for those of you who know, Aristotle was the father of biology. So when we speak of philosophy in ancient Greece, it's the literal meaning of that philosophia is love of wisdom. So it doesn't have this disciplinary connotation that philosophy is this particular discipline, this particular field. It's a love of knowing, it's a love of wisdom, right? It's a love of inquiry. So there are, a lot of branches of knowledge that Aristotle dipped his feet into. So many fields such as mathematics, astronomy, physics, all of these things were considered parts of natural philosophy. Even later on, no, Isaac Newton's greatest work, Principia Mathematica, doesn't have the title science in it, right? But it has the title natural philosophy. So during this time, it was typical of philosophers in pre-modern period to deal with subject matters that are usually only left to scientists today. Now, when we speak of the modern scientific worldview, this was kickstarted by the Copernican revolution. No? Again, this tries to place the sun at the center of the system, at the center of the universe. Okay. Prior to this, you have the geocentric model of the universe, which was the predominantly accepted worldview. Again, because the church also upheld it. And you have to understand that the church has a very wide range of control and influence. Right? Kaya nga kung ano ang sinasabi ng church noon, that is orthodox. That is the truth. Right? Which will have its negative implications, of course, later on. So geocentrism had its origins in pre-Socratic philosophy, cosmology, and astronomy through thinkers such as Anaximander and Pythagoras. This sort of understanding the universe with Earth at the center became fundamental in Aristotelian physics until it was further developed and eventually standardized by Ptolemy or Claudius Ptolemaeus. Right? Leo mentioned in the chat another term that is important here, anthropocentrism. Being centered on man. And I suppose this plays a huge part as well in terms of talking about the pride and arrogance of human beings as a species, because of course when the transition happened from myth to natural philosophy, right? When that transition happened, it also set the foundation for inquiring where we are and who is this we. No. So when we try to address the question of the human being, there was also a shift from natural philosophy to a more anthropocentric philosophy, which involved the study of politics and morality. And with that, we could understand at least one of a very significant reason why um, human beings found themselves at the center of all, of everything. Human beings believe that they are in this, special place, so to speak. So the geocentric model of the universe remained unchallenged for about 1800 years. Imagine that. Ngayon, if you are going to do a research paper, halimbawa, even in science or in your SOC subjects, I don't know if this is the case, but there are some disciplines that would say that um what do you call this? There are some disciplines that would say that you cannot use a source that is older than 5 years. Meron bang ganun dito? Or older than 3 years? Have you been given instructions like that? Yung kapag gagawa kayo ng research paper, you're not allowed to use sources in 3 or 5 years. Okay, so at least I see Leo here. Okay, so that is a common thing, right? But imagine imagine the theory. Ayan, Jubilin also says here, especially in some review of related literature. Yeah, kailangan bago lagi yung sources nyo. Because what's the reason behind that? The reason simply is because knowledge keeps on updating. Right? But that wasn't the thinking in the pre-modern period. That wasn't the thinking. The thinking was that people in the past have already figured it out. Our function today is to know what they've learned. No? And this ties up to the history of education. Because during this time, by and large, education was conceived as mastery of past knowledge, mastery of previously established knowledge. Kaya nga, it's just the transference of knowledge. The great works, for instance, in medieval ages, in the medieval period, are not necessarily, what do you call this, they're not necessarily new books. More or less, they're commentaries. Right? More or less, they're commentaries. So a lot of stuff that happened in the pre-modern period points to the fact that there wasn't any, no, or to put it in another way, there was no culture that would allow for the creation of new knowledge, because what was important then was the preservation and the learning of previously established knowledge. Okay. So it wasn't until 1542 that this worldview was famously criticized by Copernicus by alternatively advancing the heliocentric model. Now, against the grand narratives of the history of science, again, the grand narratives of the history of science often sway us to think that this was a groundbreaking achievement, but it is very important to note that variants of heliocentric model or heliocentrism were already in existence during the Antiquity and Middle Ages. It wasn't just as prevalent as the theory of Copernicus. And perhaps the dedication to the Pope was something that helped boost its marketability. So Copernican heliocentrism suggested a radical alternative. As opposed to the Earth, it was the sun that was fixed at the center of the universe, and all the other planets, including the Earth, revolved around it. Okay, so with heliocentrism, of course, Earth lost its special place at the center of creation. Right? It became just another planet, which is most probably why Copernican astronomy later on was met with resistance, especially from the Catholic Church. Because remember, the greatest creation of God was man. and man was created imago Dei, from the image of God. And the home of the image of God should be at the center of creation, right? There's a visual, I don't know if you can imagine it visually. If Earth loses its place at the center of the universe, it becomes just another planet. No, and of course that sort of touches upon the fragile ego of the church, or not even the church, the fragile ego of human beings. We want to be at the center, right? By the time the church had already accepted and endorsed the Aristotelian science with high regard, so much so that it formed part of the official position and teachings of the church, right? But again, this was Aristotelian philosophy was not accepted wholesale. There are aspects of Aristotelianism, which we'll discuss later on in the medieval period, that were also met with resistance. So the church was being very selective. It wants to preserve what it can insofar as it supports the doctrine of the church. But on the other hand, it also wants to reject what seems to contradict the doctrines of the church. So for example, in 1616, the church banned all books that emphasized the earth's movement as opposed to its stationary place at the center of the universe. But within a century, what seemed so impossible to comprehend, much more accept, had eventually become an established scientific truth. So it became an established scientific truth that the earth was at the sun was at the center. No? So Copernican revolution also paved the way for the development of modern physics through two figures influenced by Copernicus, Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei. Kepler's contribution was to argue that the planets move around the sun in ellipses, not in circular orbits. Again, this is a very advanced way of seeing it. In ellipses, not in circular orbits. Galileo, being one of the pioneers of the telescope, has made important discoveries in astronomy as well. So, Copernicus indeed kickstarted the Copernican revolution. But there was the follow through, so to speak, was able to happen because Kepler and Galileo were able to convince the scientific community, which was then held at the palm of the church. They were able to convince the scientific community to convert to Copernicanism. What was once ridiculous and heretic eventually became scientifically orthodox. So, Galileo was also instrumental in the development of modern physics and by extension modern science, specifically in the field of mechanics. No? What would eventually be his law of gravitation refuted the long-standing position that heavier bodies fall faster than lighter bodies. That was the realism of Aristotle. Of course, when you conduct this experiment, I don't know if you try and hold a feather in one hand and your phone on the other hand. No, if you drop them both on the same time, of course, it would make sense that the phone would fall faster because heavier bodies fall faster than lighter objects such as the feather. And for a very significant period of time, that remained unchallenged because that made sense. But Galileo was trying to tell us that actually the rate of falling, the rate at which these objects would fall is the same, right? It's 9.8 meters per second squared. The only reason why they don't fall at the same time is because of air drag or resistance. No? But Galileo was arguing that in a vacuum, they would fall towards the earth at the same rate, irrespective of the weight. So Galileo is also very important because he used the abstract language of mathematics to understand the behavior of objects in our world. Right? Before, mathematics was considered to be independent of the sciences. It was a highly valued discipline, no doubt. But because it was so abstract, people think it didn't have anything to do with what is real. Okay. So because there is an emphasis in the use of mathematics, Galileo was also instrumental in emphasizing the importance of experimentation, which is a key aspect of modern science. Experimentation. So this paved the way for a more empirical study of nature and reality. Okay, again, which is not to say that the pre-modern sciences weren't empirical, sure, but they were very limited. And Galileo, because of the advancement of his time, because of technological advancements, was arguing for a better empiricism. No? So the empirical approach would eventually be the distinguishing feature of modern science. And empirical comes from the Greek word emperia, meaning experience. Okay. So after Galileo, you have Descartes, who developed mechanical philosophy, in which he advanced the idea that the world consists of particles of matter that interact and collide with one another. Again, this would be very instrumental to Newton later on, who sought to improve Descartes' mechanical philosophy. And the result of that, the result of Newton's engagement with Descartes, was the laws of motion and the principle of universal gravitation. Right? As I was telling you a while ago, one of the greatest works in physics, in science, doesn't have the title physics or science, doesn't have the word physics or science in its title. Right? So you have here Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. Okay? Natural philosophy and the principles of mathematics. Because physics was originally known as natural philosophy, although there would be some important distinctions. Okay. Now, an important thing to note is that by the 18th and 19th century, by the 1700s and the 1800s, there were also notable advances in the fields of chemistry, optics, the study of light, energy, thermodynamics, the study of heat, and electromagnetism. Now, these are significant advances, but they already fall under a Newtonian concept of the universe. So the most important thing that you have to understand here is that meron ng accepted framework. What they are doing, what advances in sciences was doing at this period, was just trying to fill in the details, fill in the gaps, so to speak. So scientists accepted Newton's conception as essentially correct. All that remained to be done was to fill in the details. So if you look closer into the history of the development of science, you shall find that this type of phenomenon has occurred in various periods. This type of pattern occurs in different periods. You have a discovery, you have advances along that line, and then for a long period of time, or even just for a short period of time, that sort of becomes what is orthodox. And then there would be a radical break. No? Radical break, by which I mean there would be a break from that framework. And then there would be a new discovery. It's very interesting to view the history of science in that particular way. So in the 18th and 19th century, systemic thinking gradually declined. And what this means basically is that the grand theories of everything gradually became out of fashion. There's no need for it. Newton, Galileo, and so on already figured things out. All that remains to be done is to fill in the details. So that was true, not only in physics, but also in philosophy and science in general. Immanuel Kant was, operating against the backdrop of a Newtonian conception of universe. That everything, it's a mechanical universe, basically, that everything can be understood. Everything everything operates according to certain laws. But Kant and subsequently post-Kantian German idealism raised some very important philosophical questions about that. And the argument is very simple. Okay, if we could understand nature mechanically, no, if we can understand the mechanics of nature, what does that make us humans? What does that make of us? Because human beings are a part of nature. So, anong mangyayari ngayon sa ating free will? Anong mangyayari ngayon sa ating freedom if at the end of the day, human beings as part of nature can apparently be understood through certain laws? No? So that became sort of one of the ground problems that they undertook. Excuse me. So grand theories of everything became slowly but gradually obsolete as the foundational works have already been established, and all that needed to be done was to iron out the details. But of course, again, such endings are always endings in the meantime, until such time that radical discoveries um, will be advanced. So even if Newton's framework was the prevalent one today in the 20th and the 21st century, advancements in physics were carried out as the result of the development of theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, both of which challenged the Newtonian framework. Studies in string theory and black holes, among other things, challenged the prevalence of Newtonian physics. There are a lot of documentaries, for instance, in Netflix on black holes, and if you have some small interest, or if you have any interest at all in that particular aspect of the sciences, it is quite interesting because you see scientists there like Stephen Hawking. They are very excited. Of course, Stephen Hawking did not live to see the newer discoveries, but they're very excited about the possibility of challenging the Newtonian framework, because the laws that govern the black holes do not necessarily apply to, or in other words, the laws that govern the universe do not necessarily apply to what they observe insofar as these black holes are concerned, right? So of course, we focused on physics because it is regarded as the most fundamental of all scientific disciplines. But there are other notable advancements in the field of biology, molecular biology, computer science, artificial intelligence, linguistics, neuroscience, etc. Okay, and the 21st century saw the emergence of cognitive sciences, which is a more empirical traditional psychology. It's something that I would like you to think, even if we did this overview, or even if we just did this overview, and what can you observe, right, from the major developments in the history of science? And to a great extent, this is something that I want you to understand, and this is something that already hinted at earlier, and it's that there's never any sort of permanency, right? If you want an authentic scientific culture, there never has to be a state of permanency, right? So why when you think about developments in the history of science, it should always take into consideration the radical attempts to transform certain scientific frameworks, right? So laging merong paradigm shift. So I emphasize this because there is a tendency in science even to remain closed, right? But according to philosophers of science, such as, for example, Karl Popper, the fundamental feature of a scientific theory is that it should be falsifiable. Something could be said to be a scientific theory if it is possible to prove it wrong, by which he means if it is testable. If you cannot test it, that cannot be a scientific theory, right? Thomas Kuhn is also another very interesting philosopher of science, because he argued that many contemporary developments in science rely on frameworks that have already been established. In other words, it relied on accepted truths. Okay. So scientists today have the tendency to simply solve puzzles within their established worldviews. Some scientists just remain in their particular field or even subfield of a subfield. Yung tinatawag nating kultura ng hyper-specialization. Right? So, according to Thomas Kuhn, scientific revolutions happen when we go beyond our paradigm. Kaya nga, quantum physics, the theory of relativity, these are acknowledged to be scientific revolutions because they try to go above and beyond Newton's framework. Okay? Paul Feyerabend, moreover, advocated epistemological anarchism. This is very interesting. No? As the foundation of scientific method, because it relies on the fact that many important scientific discoveries were accidental. Right? And this is very trivial, but there are a lot of scientific discoveries that were accidental. Penicillin was accidentally discovered. Diba? The reason for Feyerabend's emphasis of epistemological anarchism is that we shouldn't remain imprisoned in a certain method. We shouldn't remain imprisoned in a certain framework, so much so that we find it heretic to go out of it. Okay? So in other words, breaking away from a certain dogmatic reliance on scientific method can help us achieve progress. But again, scientific method, including in its empirical character, including the emphasis on experimentation, this is what made modern science modern. But these philosophers of science, Popper, Kuhn, and Feyerabend, is trying to tell us that a lot of important discoveries were made outside the coordinates of an existing paradigm. A lot of important discoveries arose from the fact that some scientists thought it proper to create new possibilities. Diba? To create new possibilities. Okay? Do you have any questions so far? If there's any important takeaway that I want you to understand in the history of science, that would be it. That would be the pattern that we talked about, right? And the second important takeaway that I want you to keep in mind is that there's also a value in going outside the framework of a given coordinate. Because sometimes if you remain in it too much, everything that you do, right? Everything that you do happens within that sort of limit. You're not able to transcend that limit, right? There's in May of 1968 there was a revolution in France, and one of their slogans, I like this very much, is demand the impossible. Be realistic, demand the impossible. And that speaks truth even in terms of the history of science. But sometimes, we are studying something and we have this crazy idea, and then people would say, well, we have to be realistic. That's not possible. That's impossible. But again, a lot of very important happenings or events in our history was at some point deemed impossible, diba? If you think about it, a lot of landmark events in our history was at a certain point in time, it was deemed impossible. It was deemed impossible in American Constitution to abolish slavery. Slavery was part of their legal framework. It was deemed impossible at a certain point in time for people of color, to drink in the same water fountain as white people, to ride in the same bus as the white people, to go to school, in the same school as the white people go to. It was at one point deemed impossible for women to vote. It was at one point deemed impossible for male and female students to go up the same staircase in a school or in a university, right? UP Baguio probably did not have that sort of tradition, but older schools had that tradition. In the University of Santo Tomas, for instance, there were buildings that, or there are buildings that still have this two sets of staircases, one on the left side of the building, one on the right. Kasi pag aakyat, bawal magkasama ang babae at lalaki. A lot of important historical events, landmark historical events, were at one point deemed impossible. So if there's any takeaway from this brief intro to modern science, it's that revolutions happened when the impossible is made to be possible. That's a very cheesy way of putting it, but that is actually true, right? That is actually what sort of characterizes their history. So those are the two main takeaways that I want you to keep in mind. Now, any questions, thoughts, concerns, clarifications, anything at all at this point? Anything at all? Questions, thoughts, ideas, clarifications? Okay. Thank you, Irish. How about the others?
None so far, sir.
Okay. Okay pa? All right. So now I mentioned earlier that the modern social sciences emerged from the modern sciences, and much as I would want to give you a preview of that in a more comprehensive way, I'll reserve the discussion when we come to the period of modernity. But basically, what happened was that social inquiries, as I've said, which have already been in existence since the ancient period, and has been a part of the tradition of philosophy and so on. They wanted to get a bit more certain, so they adapted the language of the sciences, right? They adapted the language of the sciences, which is why you have this sort of combination between social and sciences, a social inquiry that is at the same time scientific. Okay. Now, we'll talk a bit more about that, but of course, we are already coming here from a certain horizon of understanding, in which we understand that the social sciences deal with certain scientific inquiries, which is why at times there's an overlap between the social sciences, the liberal arts, or the humanities. Now, for the last minutes of this session, I do want to work on um, the reading that I posted for this week, which is Robert Redfield's The Art of the Social Sciences. Have you had the chance to read this one? The Art of the Social Sciences.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So again, just as before, our practice would be, what are some important takeaways that you noticed here? What are some important points that you wish to share? What are some uh, questions that you might have in relation to these readings that we could talk about? Joshua, would you have any?
Sir, siguro po yung point ni... Wait lang po, sir.
Sure. The question is open to others as well. You're more than welcome to share your thoughts and ideas regarding this reading.
Kung sabi po ni Concern na um, yung he resolved coolly, look for neither monster nor angel. He would look at what he should find and grasp it in its whole and natural condition as one would look at a newly arrived class of animal. Yung pinag-uusapan po yata dito is kung paano po titignan ng mga ng student of sociology yung mismong study. Kasi parang ang punto po kasi nila is to prove something new. Kaya po kailangan po mag-maintain ng objective na standpoint. While at the same time po parang ini-encourage po nila yung mga tao na parang gamitin po yung humanity nila to look at their subjects so that they will not forget parang ano po yung purpose ng study nila kung para kanino po yung study nila, which is para po sa tao.
Yeah. There is a very important point there, Joshua. That's actually one of the more important takeaways in the reading. One of the more important points in the reading is because the reading is trying to tell us that the social sciences also has this characteristic as an art, but art not as in drawing or painting, etc., but more of art in general sense as a field that encourages creativity, as a field that encourages skill. Because by the time that when was this published? This was, if you look at the date of the publication, this was written and published in 1948. And by this time, you already have more or less an institutionalized social sciences. And apart, I don't know if this is something that that you guys talk about in your major subjects, but there is a part of the history of social sciences that featured what we call conflict in terms of method, the conflict of methods. In German, they call that phenomenon Methodenstreit, the conflict of method, because there is an aspect of social sciences that was very much imprisoned, that was very much secluded in data gathering, in interviews, etc. But sorry, there are aspects of social sciences as well that were more humanistic, more philosophical. So one of the important points that I think Joshua also shared here is that if you look at page 188, and this is the one of the key phrase, I think, and Robert Redfield says that in stressing the necessity in good social science for the investigator to think and to speculate independently and freely, in emphasizing the reliance of good social science upon the personal and human qualities of the investigator. This is in page 188. One seems to be talking not about a science, but about an art, and to be saying that social science is also an art. And that's the key word there. I think it's also an art, right? It's also an art. Because when you think about like how, for instance, and in terms of understanding, for instance, the social sciences in the academe, is there anyone here in attendance that who is a sociology major or sociology minor? Meron ba dito? I forgot if there's a social program in UP Baguio, but in any case, at least in some universities, no, I'm not yet thoroughly familiar in the case of UP Baguio, but in some universities, sociology in the Philippines is a bit more data oriented. And if you look at sociology in different countries, in the other countries and other universities, they're more or less theoretically oriented. And that's a sort of divide that Robert Redfield was trying to point out here. These are not to be opposed to each other kasi nga ang nangyayari oftentimes, the more data-oriented social scientists, not just sociologists, the more data-oriented social scientists would claim superiority over, the theoretically oriented social scientists. Because of course, what they say is always backed up by data, right? But, there are a lot of things that interviews and data gathering could not really point out. Right? There are a lot of things that it couldn't point out. And I remember this, in another university where I taught, I always had this colleague. I had this colleague who was an apologist for the government, an apologist for the military abuses, and he always tends to cite, like he was telling us before, look at the survey, sabi niya, look at the survey. The survey says that the people trust the military. Yung mga criticism sa military, all of that is just the propaganda of communists, socialists / Marxists / terrorists. How he was able to make the leap from Marxist to terrorist, I will never know. But that sure is a very problematic leap. But that's the point that I'm trying to make. Like, you're relying on survey and without even questioning sino ba yung mga taong tinanong, what is the the population size, right? And the same thing, I think there are I think the UP Department of Sociology, probably in Diliman, I'm not mistaken, already issued this this warning about unofficial surveys saying that halimbawa ang pulso ng mga Kabitenyo ay para kay Bongbong Marcos, ang pulso ng Manila ay para kay Isko Moreno. Yung mga ganong very unofficial Twitter surveys, kumbaga, because it sort of makes the entire process very problematic, right? And it's sort of this is where you need the critical theoretical aspect part, because it just isn't about data gathering. Okay, now I would have to end here, but I do hope that in the next meeting, week 5, I would be able to hear more from you. Thank you, Leo, Joshua, and Irish and Jubileen for sharing, but I do still hope to hear from the rest of you regarding the next reading that we would have, which is about myth and science. Okay, so if there are no questions at this point, I would have to end the class. But if you have questions, please feel free to get in touch with me. Okay, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope to see you again next meeting.
Thank you, sir.